But in order to change the hearts of the people, so the people would repent, that's the purpose of the ministry and the message of Elijah, to remember the Torah of Moses, and that message comes forth to show the people where they departed before the coming of the Messiah. And I would like to submit to you that that movement is going on now, that these are the days of Elijah. And so now that spiritual battle between Jacob and Esau is fought on all types of levels. This is the religious level that it's being played on. So if you believe in Yeshua, if you're trying to figure out how you believe the Bible and live your life in the right way, you've been taught how you should do that. And whether you realize it or not all, but part of how you've been presented and shown and taught that has been the doctrine of Esau. And how Esau basically sees Paul, that Paul taught you don't follow the Torah. Okay, and so it's being played out in the religious arena that way. But it's also being played out over the issue of the land. Because ultimately, when Joseph's bones are brought back to the land, that he's buried in Shechem. Joseph's buried in Shechem. And I don't know if you've ever been to Israel, but if you're facing this way, if you're looking this way, you have Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Shechem sits in the valley between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Mount Ebal, what? The curse. Mount Gerizim, the blessing, right? So it's sort of like Joseph's bones sitting there, and the God of Israel is saying, well, what do you think about Joseph's bones? If you think properly, you get the blessing. If not, you get the curse. And I don't know whether have you ever heard anyone mention this, like the two-house controversy, or whether the two houses is teacher. Well, what all that is that's a controversy over Joseph's bones and who Joseph is. And you have to be in the valid decision. And what do you think about Joseph's bone? Who really is Joseph? And so those who say that the two-house doctrine is heresy, they say Joseph is Judah. Now, how would you believe that Joseph is Judah? Judah's Judah. Joseph's Joseph. He's trying to tell you that Joseph's Judah. And so it's a battle over Joseph's bones. So now this gets played out. This spiritual battle, this spiritual struggle gets played out. Now you can see it physically in the land of Israel, where much of the West Bank, not all, but much of Judea, Samaria, is the inheritance of Joseph. It's the land given to Ephraim and Manasseh, much of it. So the battle is over Joseph's inheritance. Okay? And so now what happens, biblically what's happened, is Esau is trying to get the nations to agree that the firstborn rights belongs to him. That's what Esau's doing. How can I say that Esau's doing that? Because if we go to Psalm in chapter 2, if we go to Psalms, how do you like this for an overview? In Psalm chapter 2, in verse 2, it says, "The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord will have them in derision. I've set my king upon my holy hill of Zion." And so now that verse is quoted in the book of Acts. That verse is quoted in Acts in chapter 4. And in Acts chapter 4, Verse 25, it says, "Who by the mouth of your servants David has said, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? For the kings of the earth," the kings of the earth, the kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ, against Messiah. For a truth against the holy child Yeshua, whom you have anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate. Herod and Pontius Pilate was involved in this. So who's Herod? He's an Edomite. He's Esau. Who's Pontius Pilate? He's a leader of Rome. Who's Rome? Esau. So, what is Esau called? He's called the kings of the earth. Because Esau's trying to rule over the earth, so Esau's also trying to establish himself as being the one who's the kingship. So he's trying to take the kingship from Judah, and he's trying to take the firstborn from Joseph. That's what he's doing. Esau's trying to take the firstborn from Joseph and the position of kingship from Judah. And the way he takes the position of kingship from Judah is he wants to rule over Jerusalem. He wants to rule over Jerusalem. And the way he takes the firstborn from Joseph, he wants a PLO state in the mountains of Israel. Do you see the scheme? And so this is a serious act of rebellion against the God of Israel and against his covenant promise made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's why when this decree is made, Esau causes the nations to all agree. Now, in what form is Esau trying to get all the nations to agree to this? It's called the United Nations. He's trying to get the nations of the earth, the United Nations, in their governmental structure to all agree that there should be a Palestinian state in the area given to Joseph, and that they're going to make a judgment over Jerusalem to divide Jerusalem and not acknowledge Judah's right there, not acknowledge Yeshua's right there. So this is just not a casual thing. This is a spiritual battle that's really challenging the rule of Yeshua being over Israel, who he rules from Jerusalem, and it's challenging the covenant promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which then goes to Joseph. You see? You see why this is so serious? So that actually then, what the prophecies say in Ezekiel chapter 35, what the prophecies say in Ezekiel chapter 35, it's a prophecy against Esau. And in Ezekiel, in chapter 35, we're going to look at verses, Ezekiel chapter 35, and verses 12 and 13. "And you will know that I'm the Lord, and I've heard all the blasphemies you've spoken against the mountains of Israel, saying, they are laid desolate, and they are given to us consumed. Thus with your mouth you've boasted against me, and you've multiplied your words against me, and I've heard them." That's a prophecy about Esau. That Esau is saying that the mountains of Israel belongs to him. And then it says in Ezekiel 36, "Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, you mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord. Because the enemy has said against you, aha, the ancient high places are ours in possession." So then you got Ezekiel chapter 12 and 13. And Ezekiel in chapter 36, verses 1 and 2, is telling us that Esau is saying that the mountains of Israel belongs to him. Now what is the mountains of Israel? The mountains of Israel is Judea and Samaria, commonly called the West Bank, And the mountains of Israel extends into Jerusalem because Jerusalem's surrounded by mountains. And so they're saying that the mountains of Israel belongs to him. He's saying that the West Bank belongs to him and Jerusalem belongs to him. And so now, over this act of rebellion, the God of Israel is going to bring judgment against all those who's doing the rebellion. That's all nations. And so now this is the summary. I just covered the summary of what, of actually kind of like redid the teaching of what I did yesterday. And what I wanted to continue to share today is to explain the legal way in which the God of Israel is going to judge the nations and then, in essence, judge Esau. And his judgment is the judgment of what we refer to as the Great Tribulation. So, the principle I want to share with you, because what I'd like to do is I'm going to lay out to here what I'm going to cover and give you time to take a little break here, and then we'll come back and we'll finish the thought. That actually the judgment of the nations, the judgment of the nations is actually a lawsuit against the nations. The God of Israel brings a lawsuit actually a covenant lawsuit. A covenant lawsuit against the nations and a covenant lawsuit against Esau. Okay, so now in Isaiah, in chapter 34, it says, Isaiah chapter 34 and verse 8, it says, "It's the day of Yahweh's vengeance and the year of recompenses," and it says in the English, "for the controversy of Zion." See, this is all a spiritual battle over Zion. It's all over Zion. Because what does it say in Psalm 2? After the kings of the earth gather themselves together, the Almighty's going to laugh. And what's the outcome? He's going to set his king upon the holy hill of Zion. See, it's a battle over Zion. It's a controversy over Zion. And so, the word controversy, there is the Hebrew word riv. And it's from the Hebrew word riv that we get the English word rift. From riv, we get rift. A rift. A rift is a dispute with someone. And it's actually a heated dispute. One form of the way you have a heated dispute with someone is a lawsuit. And so he has a rift with the nations, and he's bringing a rift against the nations. And so then, if that is the case, when the God of Israel brings this lawsuit, he must have a legal basis to do it. He's not going to do things unlawfully. The God of Israel has to have a legal right to bring the lawsuit against the nations. And so now I'm going to amplify a little bit more regarding the significance of Jerusalem. The significance of Jerusalem. It says in 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 4, "In Jerusalem I've put my name." In Jerusalem I've put my name. Well, there's a Hebrew letter that represents the name of God. And it's the Shin. Because if you put a mezuzah on your doorpost, you're going to have the Hebrew letter Shin there. Shin is a Hebrew letter that represents El Shaddai. And El Shaddai means I'm the guardian, I'm the protector, I'm the keeper of your house. And so if you take a physical aerial photograph of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is surrounded by 3 valleys. You got the Tyropian Valley, you got the Hinnom Valley, and you got the Kidron Valley. And so if you map in the 3 valleys, the 3 valleys physically form the Hebrew letter Shin. And right here, you have the temple and the Temple Mount. And so the temple is called the house of Yeshua. He said, regarding the temple, my house shall be a house of prayer for all people. So where his house is his threshold. And it says in Ezekiel chapter 43, Son of man, verse 7, Son of man, the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever. And then he says in verse 8, in setting their threshold by my threshold. And so where he has his house, where he has his name, he has his threshold. And so you have then, Jerusalem has walls around it. This is called, actually, where Jerusalem was in older days, it's called the Old City. The Old City. And so actually then, when the enemy wants to come in and he wants to divide Jerusalem, when he wants to divide the Old City, when he wants to share the Temple Mount, he's crossing the threshold of Yeshua. He's crossing the threshold. He's placed his name there. In other words, it's a thief coming into the house. It's a thief coming into the house. And he's coming to plunder. He's coming to take the possession of the house. He's coming to take Jerusalem. You understand? And so when a thief comes in your house, if you can, you try to do something about it. And so this is the seriousness of them trying to divide Jerusalem, because where they want to make East Jerusalem the capital, it is associated with the Old City, and it's associated with the Temple Mount. And so this is why the dividing of Jerusalem is so serious, because it's a challenge to the kingship of Yeshua. It's coming in and invading his house, robbing his house, and it's challenging his covenant promise that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, that's challenging his promise that he made, that he gave that land primarily to Ephraim and Manasseh. And so then he's going to then, over this issue, have I amplified the seriousness of the issue? That he's going to bring a lawsuit against the nations. So we're going to take a break now, and what I'm going to do after the break is I'm going to share with you in what way he's going to bring that lawsuit and what's going to be the ramifications of it, what we can expect to happen in the judgment, and what we're supposed to do about it, because he wants us to do something about it, because he's coming to fulfill his promises to redeem Jacob. Let's take a break, and we'll cover that after we take our break. Okay, welcome to the second part of this teaching, where I'm going to explain to you in greater detail the legal aspect of the lawsuit that the God of Israel is going to bring against the nations for dividing his land and dividing the city of Jerusalem. And so for 400 years, the area of the Middle East was controlled by what's known as the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire aligned itself with Germany in World War I. And of course, you know, Germany lost World War I to the Allies. And following World War I, the area of the Middle East came under the control of the British on what was known as the British Mandate. And so following World War I, because there was a Jewish chemist that helped the Allies to defeat the Germans, his name was Watchman, he asked the British government in return for his help to help the British and the Allies win World War I to help to work for a homeland for the Jewish people. And the British government made a commitment to do that on November the 2nd, 1917, they issued what was known as the Balfour Declaration. And the declaration declared an intent that the British would work to establish a homeland for the Jewish people in the land of Palestine, as it was called at that time. But then, as you know, the Arabs weren't very happy about that. And the area that was originally designated to be the homeland for the Jewish people was present-day Israel plus present-day Jordan. And the Arabs protested, and as a compromise, in appeasement to the Arabs, there was the creation in 1922 of what was known as Transjordan. Trans means across from the Jordan. They dropped the trans part, now it's just called Jordan. And so basically about 80% of what was originally designated in the Balfour, as a part of the Balfour Declaration for land to be set aside for the Jewish people, was given to the Arabs as a land for peace. So this battle between the Jews and the Arabs regarding a land that would become a place for the Jewish people, the battle raged in the 20s and the 30s and into the 40s through World War II. And then after this battle from 1917 to 1947, 30 years the British was trying to appease both sides, couldn't please anybody, so they got frustrated with it, and they says, okay, we're going to give this problem over to the United Nations. And so the United Nations then ended up voting, the UN General Assembly ended up voting on November the 29th, 1947 about what to do with the issue. And what they voted is they recommended a two-state solution. They recommended that there be an Arab state and a Jewish state, and they said that Jerusalem would be an international city. So that was the recommendation of the UN General Assembly, and this recommendation, this vote, was to be implemented and go into effect at the designated end of the British Mandate. And the British Mandate was supposed to end, and this solution was to be implemented in the designated day for the end of the British Mandate. And this recommendation to be implemented was May the 14th, 1948. So that's the reason on that day, the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, declared the State of Israel. He was doing it on that day because he was saying yes. He was approving, he was accepting the vote by the UN General Assembly. So in effect, the modern State of Israel was declared through making a covenant, or agreeing to this vote, making a covenant with the United Nations. When they submitted themselves to the vote and said they would abide by the vote, they're making a covenant. They're making an agreement with the United Nations. Well, in 1948, the Arabs said no to the solution because they didn't want to share the land with the Jews. They didn't want to share Jerusalem. They wanted to have it all for themselves. So they went to war to protest the solution, and this is called the War of Independence. The Israeli War of Independence, and it was from 48 into 1949. 48 into 1949. And it ended in 1949. Now what happened in 1949 was the Jews were trapped in Jerusalem. And they were going to be starved. They had no food and no water, no access to food and water. And so there was a road that was built. The Jews built a road for them to actually recover them. And they built the road, and they got food and water, and they were saved from their situation. And the successful building of that road and the deliverance of the Jews from Jerusalem became, in effect, an element of the end of the war. So the war ended in 1949, and then they drew up borders for the conclusion of the war. And this is called I've got to write this up here. The borders that they got established from 1949 is called the 1949 Armistice Lines. I don't know if I spelled Armistice right. Okay, now the 1949 Armistice Lines, which was the borders at the conclusion of the war, the declared established borders at the end of the war, this is also called the pre-1967 borders. Because the Arabs couldn't accept this defeat. So they ended up trying to wage war against the state of Israel to defeat it in 1956. They tried to wage a war to defeat it in 1967, in 1973. And every time they tried to bring an army against the nation to eradicate it, they lost, and in 67 and 73 they lost territory. And so they ended up the territory they ended up losing from the 67 and 73 wars was the Golan Heights and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. These are the territories that the Arabs lost by trying to defeat Israel and eradicate them. And so once again, the Arabs couldn't accept defeat, and so now they're making a cry that they want their lands back. And they said, Israel is now occupying our lands illegally. And so in the discussions, Syria wants back the Golan, and the West Bank in East Jerusalem was under control of Jordan. But Jordan's sort of like relinquishing claim to them and saying that, quote-unquote, the Palestinians can have the West Bank in East Jerusalem. So now we have this created entity instead of Jordan called the Palestinians. And the Gaza Strip was under the control of Egypt, but it's kind of allowed to be governed autonomously now. Actually, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip and the Jewish people living there in August of 2005. And right now, Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank is governed by the PLO faction Fatah. Now, Yasser Arafat was the leader of Fatah. He died, And now Mahmoud Abbas is the leader of Fatah. And historically, Europe and the United States has regarded Hamas as a terrorist organization, but they call Fatah a peace partner, even though Mahmoud Abbas is a Holocaust denier. And so when the Palestinians are trying to say that the Jews living in these territories, that the Arabs lost when they tried to destroy the whole of Israel, they're saying that according to international law, Jews living in these lands that they obtained because the Arabs tried to kill them, that they're living there illegally, and they are saying that they want a solution to the conflict where this land in particular, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, gets designated as a state, a PLO state, with East Jerusalem as its capital. And the Palestinians want that state with no Jews living there. And so they say that they want a state based on viable borders, which they say is based upon 67 borders, which is the 1949 Armistice Lines. So when they're talking about the 67 borders, they're talking about the Armistice Lines from 1949. Now what I want to interject here, and I want to do it with caution, okay? Because I believe the Bible has called, and the God of Israel has made those to be watchmen on the walls. Part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is because I believe I've called to be a watchman on the wall. And as a watchman, I'm sharing with you what I'm seeing. This presentation is a watchman message to share with you what I'm seeing, what I see from the wall. And I'm reporting to you what I see from the wall. And so I believe as a watchman that we should be watching events and wait for events to happen regardless of how long it takes for the events to happen. A watchman didn't take out a calculator, and the old biblical didn't take out a calculator and said, I think in 52 years the Babylonians are coming. No, he reported what he saw at the moment, at time, real time, in the risk analysis, real time. Is anyone coming? We got to report they're literally coming. So you watch events. Can I emphasize we watch events? Nevertheless, I'm going to give you an interesting calculation. Don't put your weight on calculation over a watchman, okay? And that is, if we take Daniel's 70-week prophecy, and the prophecy is based upon a command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now there's a variety of ways that you can interpret the prophecy. And there is an application of interpreting things that a week equals a year. So one way, remember Hebraically there's multiple ways. There's not just one way and only one way. They can be interpreted multiple ways at the same time. So one of the ways that this could be interpreted is this 70-week prophecy is going to be a reference to 70 years. And 70 years is one of the biblical definitions of a generation. Generation could be seen as 70 years. We're given 70 years to live, it says in Psalms. Well, that's a generation. Your life is a generation. Okay, so now, given that the Jews were able to live their lives in Jerusalem following successfully rescuing them from them being trapped in 1949, they got rescued. They were then, after they were rescued and the war ended, they were able to live their lives and build in Jerusalem. They were given freedom to build in Jerusalem, in essence. So if you take that as a starting point, that they're able to rebuild Jerusalem, and connect it that 70 weeks is 70 years, the final generation, That means the final generation would go from 1949 to 2019. And then if you back up, that Messiah would come in 2019. He comes after a 3.5-year Great Tribulation. That would put the timing of the start of the Great Tribulation in the spring or Passover of 2016 would be the start of the Great Tribulation. Now, we are watching to see if this can happen. We're not saying that it will. We're watching to see whether it can happen. In my perspective, I think it's possible, but I'm still going to wait to see the confirmation of the events. And so this could be the significance of 1949, because that's what they're arguing about. They want the 1949 lines is the pre-1967 borders, and they sometimes shorten it to say the 67 borders. They want to state on the 67 borders or the 49 lines. So they're arguing over 1949. And so then we have then, following that UN vote, November 29th, 1947, they, in essence, the UN General Assembly recommended a two-state solution. They recommended a two-state solution and to share Jerusalem. So why is the policy of the United States and Europe that they want a two-state solution to share Jerusalem? Because they want things to line up with the United Nations and the votes in the desires of the United Nations. They want the world to be structured and line up with the United Nations. And what's voted on and agreed upon in the United Nations called international law. And so then what happens is on November the 29th, 2012, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas brings again before the UN General Assembly a petition that the nations of the world would recognize a Palestinian state based upon East Jerusalem as its capital. And so when that vote was taken, over 130 nations of the world voted yes. Now, remember, if the God of Israel brings a lawsuit, he's going to do it legally. He cannot judge the nations unless he has a legal basis to do so. I mean, why has he got to judge Zimbabwe for? What did Zimbabwe do wrong in the dividing of the land and in the dividing of Jerusalem? Well, ultimately, they got a vote on it. That's why he has a legal right. They took a position on it. Okay, so now things are positioning that he can judge the nations, and then ultimately there were only 9 nations of the world that voted no. Okay? Among the 9 nations that voted no to not recognize a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, one of the 9 nations that voted no was the United States of America. Now, the reason why the United States of America voted no was not because in policy they're against the Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as the capital. They wanted to see it come about by direct negotiations. And actually what the United States calls direct negotiations is, I'm going to pressure you and twist your arm until you cry and scream till you agree to do what I want you to do, sign the piece of paper. We negotiated, right? That's what they call direct negotiations. You're going to sign the piece of paper so I can say, hey, you know, we agreed to this. So it doesn't look like I took a gun to your head. Okay, but now, because this is not truly the position of the United States, that they're against the Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, this sets up, I believe, for Bible prophecy to come to be fulfilled as it relates to the battle between Jacob and Esau. Because if we go to Genesis in chapter 33, If we go to Genesis chapter 33, this is where Jacob and Esau are with each other. And it says in verse 4, Genesis 33 verse 4, it says, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Well, that on the surface appears like, okay, things were okay. But if you look at the verse in a Torah scroll where it says, and he kissed him, there's dots above and he kissed him in the Torah scroll. And a special notation in the Torah scroll means, pay attention to this. And there's an additional element of understanding relating to this. And so what the rabbis teach is the reason for the dots is the text says he kissed him, implied that it was okay, but in his heart he still had hatred toward him. And the dots represent his heart mindset. He wanted to bite him. He wanted to bite. He still had hatred. The dots represents bite, which represents animosity in the heart. So this then is called the kiss of Esau. Okay? So actually the kiss of Esau is insincerity. I embrace you, but I'm not sincere. So another way to refer to the kiss of Esau is, this is a kiss of betrayal. So in other words, the Torah is teaching us in the battle between Jacob and Esau and them trying to reconcile, that Esau will betray Jacob. That's the message. That's the teaching. Now what I need to do is I need to bring in another principle to you so you can understand the connection and the association. And the principle is this: Israel, Torah, and the God of Israel, or the Messiah. Israel, Torah, and the Messiah are one. They're one. You can't separate them. Actually, if you really understand it, this is a marriage relationship. Because the Messiah entered into marriage with Israel at Mount Sinai when he gave the Torah. They're one. So because they're one, because they're in a covenant together, because they're in a marriage together, then we have this principle, because you're married, you're in a covenant together, your destinies are intertwined, is that what happens to Israel happens to the Messiah. And also, what happens to the Messiah then happens to Israel. What happens to Israel happens to the Messiah. What happens to the Messiah happens to Israel. Now, in order to kind of, in an overview, see that this is laid out this way, if you've ever looked at the book of Matthew, and Matthew chapter 2 talks about the birth of Yeshua in Bethlehem, and then Herod wants to kill him. Herod's Esau. And so he's told to go to Egypt. He's born in Bethlehem. He goes to Egypt. Then when Herod dies, he comes out of Egypt. And then instead of crossing the Red Sea, they go into the Promised Land, and they went in at Jericho. So now Yeshua is being immersed at Jericho. And then Matthew chapter 4, he's in the wilderness being tempted for 40 days. And then after he's tempted for 40 days, then he's on a mount giving a message. It's paralleling what happened to Israel. Israel went to Egypt, Messiah went to Egypt. Israel came out of Egypt, was freed from Egypt at the death of Pharaoh. Messiah comes out of Egypt at the death of Herod. Israel crosses the Red Sea, but Messiah is taken to the Promised Land. He's immersed in the Jordan. Israel's 40 years in the wilderness. Messiah is tempted for 40 years. Israel's given the Torah at Mount Sinai. Yeshua is teaching the Torah from a mountain. Matthew chapter 5. You see the parallel? What happens to Israel happens to Messiah. What happens to Messiah happens to Israel. It's trying to communicate that concept to you. Okay? So then, ultimately, when Yeshua rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, where they're initially praising him and declaring he's our king, ultimately then, following Yeshua having his Last Supper, his Passover meal, it sets up the circumstances for his trial. And how his trial was set up is Yeshua was betrayed. Yeshua was betrayed by Judas with a kiss. He's betrayed with a kiss. That's the prophetic kiss of Esau. And so what happens is the betrayal sets up a trial. First the betrayal, then a trial. And in essence, when the trial goes on, Yeshua is falsely accused. He's falsely accused and he's crucified. But then he gets resurrected. That's just not historical information. That's a prophecy. That's a prophecy that Israel is going to get betrayed by Esau, because Esau is gathering the nations against him, against Jacob. Israel is going to be betrayed by Esau, by the nations, and in the betrayal, the nations will put Israel on trial. And in the trial, Israel is going to get falsely accused, and the nations are going to try to do away with Israel as a nation, to crucify it. But ultimately, Israel is going to get resurrected. And the resurrection of Israel is twofold. What in the Bible is called resurrection is the end of the exile, and the gathering of the 12 tribes. And the resurrection is Israel being at the head of the nations. Israel being at the head of the nations. Israel's the head of the nations when Messiah rules and reigns in his kingdom. That's her resurrection. So, because biblical history is prophecy, all you got to do is know history, and I can tell you what's going to happen. So we know what's going to happen here. And so this is what's set up. We are in process of the nations taking a legal position to declare the dividing of the land of Israel in the city of Jerusalem in recognition of a Palestinian state. As of now, as of November 29, 2012, all the nations have voted. But that vote does not have the status of legality as it relates to recognizing a Palestinian state. And the reason is because in the United Nations, that only the UN Security Council, has the power to recognize a state. And the way the UN Security Council is structured is there's 15 members on the UN Security Council. 10 are rotating. They only serve for a period of time. 5 are permanent. And the 5 permanent have veto rights over anything that comes before the UN Security Council. So who are the 5 nations that have veto rights? You have U.S., China, Russia, the British, and France. Now it's kind of interesting who makes up these members, because if you look at their bigger characteristic, what color is China associated with? Okay. What color is Russia associated with? Red. And what color is red associated with? Esau. Okay. This takes a little bit more doing. But for those who make a tribal connection to countries, do you know, those who've done those studies, what tribe that is associated and connected with France? For those who do that study, do you know what their conclusion is? You know what tribe of Israel they connect to France? Reuben. And for those who do those studies, you know what tribe association they make with the United States and Britain? They associate Britain with Ephraim and the USA with Manasseh, which means Joseph. Okay? Now look to see who's on the council that gets to decide the issues of the affairs of the world. These are the firstborns debating things. So this is Esau, the firstborn, and here's Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, and then here's God's firstborn, Ephraim and Manasseh. So this is all a debate, and those who had positions of firstborn are ruling and making decisions about the affairs of the world and what they're going to recognize and what. So actually, it's these firstborn entities that get to decide the destiny of. And what they believe about the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What they believe about the land. What they believe about... Isn't this like fascinating?
You're doing good.
Okay, so now historically, because the United States has wanted the solution to be based upon negotiations, and they've been firm on that stance since 1967, whenever the Arab world has wanted there to be a UN Security Council to recognize a Palestinian state, at the thought of that, the United States would say, no, we're going to veto. We're not going to honor that. It's not going to happen that way. And so this is the reason why on November 29, 2012, the United States said no. And them saying no now sets up for the United States to... It sets up for the United States to betray Israel. For the United States to fulfill the kiss of Esau.
Yeah, they will.
Somebody's seeing it. I heard an oh my gosh, that means you're seeing it.
Say it again.
And so, therefore, we have a president of the United States who throughout his term is saying, I'm a friend of Israel. I'm a friend of Israel. Israel's never had a better friend than me. I am the best in the... I am the friend of Israel. I will defend and I will guarantee Israel's security. And if you try to say that somehow I'm opposed to Israel, how dare you say I'm opposed to Israel? I'm a friend of Israel. Don't you know how much money I give Israel? How much military I give to Israel? And I'm really for Israel. I just don't like Netanyahu. I'm really for Israel. I just don't like Netanyahu. He's the problem. But I really like Israel. If we can get rid of that problem, I still like Israel. Meanwhile, in his administration, one of the first things he does, he gives a speech to the Arab world and says, we're going to change our relations with Islam. And Islam doesn't like Israel.
No.
And so, what has just happened recently, in the last couple months, is Obama is sending forth the message of, just depends upon what Netanyahu does, what government he forms, and what position he takes now. You know, the United States is hinting that maybe we may not support Israel at the United Nations anymore. Maybe if there's a resolution coming up that's written to recognize a Palestinian state and outlines a solution to this issue, and if Britain and France together are working on such a proposal, and then we'll study it, but we think that we could possibly support something like. Just depends on what you do, Israel. Just depends on what you do, Netanyahu. We are considering this over here. That's how things presently are now.